Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to the Substack Live for this week, where we're going to be talking about helping people prepare perhaps a submission on the NCEA changes. I'm Maury Abraham, and joining me is...
Kia ora, I'm Kieran Gainsford. I'm Head of Science at Wandry Hill College and PBTA Junior Vice President. Kia ora.
Kia ora. So I thought perhaps each of us would start off by just sort of giving our initial thoughts around the change, and some things that people might need to think about, or some things that have been playing on each of our mind. And the first one for me is that this is quite a major upheaval, what's been proposed, and I think that's surprised quite a few people. And that has been compounded by the fact that it's major, but there's been very little meaningful consultation with those of us in the profession. So many of us have been quite surprised. And not only is it major, but there doesn't really seem to be a clear rationale for why such big changes are being made. And throughout the discussion document, the ministry often speaks about how it's important that a strong curriculum should drive teaching and learning, and our national qualification should reflect achievement of that. And so it's really challenging for us to be making submissions on qualification when we don't have any settledness around the curriculum. So those are my initial thoughts. What about you, Kieran?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, the thing that sort of concerns me very much at the outset is how little detail we've been given to respond to at this stage as a profession and as professionals. I think the ministry intends to manufacture a bit of a consensus around let's go forward with this and then come up with the details later. But that's pretty insufficient in my view, and also doesn't really respect the expertise that's out there in the sector. People know what's going to work in their schools and in their classrooms, but the devil, as always, is in the detail. So for me, that's really the big thing. We know that among secondary teachers already there's a pretty wide spectrum of opinion about this program of change, but even among those who support the direction, there's a real sense of concern that the changes won't work for certain groups of students and it won't work for their school or their setting, or it might, but they wouldn't know because there's no detail provided. So that's really the big issue at this stage.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a couple of other assumptions that they make too that I think need to be questioned. Like, I don't understand the concern around why internal assessments throw up more excellence than external. I mean, that's presented as a problem, whereas it actually might be an indication that internal assessment might be a more appropriate ways of assessing some kids. And also a bit concerned about the long bow that they're drawing when they look at the data around unit standards, and they have a look at some of the unit standards being offered and draw conclusions around people playing games with the system rather than perhaps accepting it might be more appropriate pathways for a lot of our kids.
Yeah, and I think what that reflects is, I think, that assumption that they're making is reflected in the questions that they're asking in the consultation survey. And those questions, often say things like, do you agree with X assumption? With the kind of implication that maybe you're a bit wrong and bad if you don't. Now, you may or may not agree, but I think it's important that the questions are neutral. And that's why there is a PPTA survey that's been set up that is intended to mirror the same questions to get the same information, but without the bias and in some cases, with poorly worded questions. So it's intended to enable people to answer all parts from a neutral perspective. So actually, the government will actually get proper feedback about what people think.
So where can people access that survey, Kieran?
On the PBTA website, if you look under the campaigns tab, campaigning tab, there's a big capital letters says "Have your say on the NCEA changes." So that's the best place people can go and ensure that you can be heard neutrally.
Cool. Okay, well, look, there's 4 main proposals, so I thought maybe we whip through those 4 and each of us just sharing, our points of view. I mean, the first one's in relation to the VET, the vocational education training standards, and one of the big issues that I have that I think people need to think about is that why is there a drive for the VET aspects of the qualification to be straitjacketed, into the single subject formula that they're proposing. Some students want to explore a whole wide range of trade opportunities and may not want to commit one of the year-long subjects to one particular VET subject. So, to me, that's a bit of an issue.
Yeah, and I think it raises a broader question about how many and which vocational subjects will exist too, and there's a question there about what's going to be valued, which industry groups are going to have the capability to set up and run a subject. And I think those questions, it's unfortunate that those questions might be what dictates ending up in schools. And I think there's also a question that we don't have any detail on about how some of this VET stuff is going to interact with the traditional kind of learning areas or departments in secondary schools. And technology is one that jumps out. To what extent will current learning that's offered by technology departments in secondary schools be delivered as VET subjects, and what will be delivered as what they're calling kind of general subjects? We just don't know the answers to that. And so it's really hard for technology teachers, for example, to actually have informed feedback on that. But I think it's important that people say that they need to know this to be able to evaluate how the VET stuff's going to work. And some of that's going to be big. The VET subjects, if they're going to work, some of them will have to be designed from pretty much from scratch with an industry group leading that. That's a huge piece of work. So I'm a little bit concerned about the time frame that's going to be realistic, much harder than for what the traditional school subjects it's going to be. There are also some questions around Proposal 2 on the Foundation Award. And I think what people are concerned about is not so much that there's a lit num co-requisite in some way. Schools are quite used to that concept by now. But what is the consideration that's being given to the gatekeeping function that's going to serve in schools? What about the students, for example, who come in increasing numbers to New Zealand with English as a second language and they arrive in the senior secondary school? Is there a vision for how the sector and the education system more broadly is supposed to respond to and serve their needs as senior secondary students? We don't know, but it's a question that needs answering if we're going to evaluate whether this is going to work. And also, more generally, it's going to lead to more students without qualification, perhaps. So what are we going to do with and for those young people?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, when they're talking about a structure of 5 subjects that students have to take, there's going to be literacy and numeracy requirements. I can't help but think that they think Year 11 English equals literacy and Year 11 Maths might equal numeracy, and I'm not sure whether all Maths and English teachers would necessarily share that view. And I think the gatekeeper concept, or that issue is hugely important, so that we can maintain equity and inclusion within the qualification. I note that they asked the question in the document as to should other things be considered as well for the Foundation Award, i.e. attendance. And, that rattles a few alarm bells for me as well. I'm open to the idea of a Foundation Award including some important dispositional skills that show people have become, strong, independent learners or ready for the workforce or whatever. But I'm a little bit alarmed if there's a proposal around some sort of attendance in relation to the achievement of the qualification. And I'm also wondering, will learning in other subjects be considered to be a vital part of a Foundation Award? And I think it comes down to the issue that we're experiencing is that there's so little detail that it's actually hard to respond. And I suppose I just encourage people in their submissions to be raising these questions and to say that they're questions they have. And if we move on to proposal 3, the idea that everything will be built around subjects. And my big question is, what's the thinking and research that has determined that all learning will be delivered by single siloed subjects? And where has the robust discussion been that explores the benefits of single subjects and also interdisciplinary, project-based, if you like, approaches? Where has that discussion been? And why have we settled on everything will be built around single subjects? And the exemplar record of learning tells us little about what a student knows or can do. When I was looking at it, I thought, what does the student who scored 46 for geography know, and what can they do in geography? Because there's a fair amount that they can. But also, what does it mean for the student who scored 64 in maths? What are the bits of maths that they can't do, and the bits of maths that they don't know? And our final point, I suppose, is that it raises questions for me about students doing part-time study. If a course is going to be 5 subjects and you've got to pass 4, how does that affect a student who's doing part-time study? And how will it affect students who want to work at multiple levels, year levels? So those are my questions.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of, it's really telling how many questions we've got at this stage, I think, isn't it? But this subject-based qualification, certainly what we've heard from PBTA's heard from our members, is this is the one that's really dividing opinion, perhaps more than any other. And the issue again that people have is how's it going to work in schools? And so the question I've heard quite a bit actually is people who are really keen on interdisciplinary cross-curricular approaches, and actually from some others as well who are very keen on more traditional approaches in their schools as well. Everyone's kind of saying, well, what does that actually mean in terms of if a school wants to run interdisciplinary programs, can that still work with the single subject assessment or not? The issue, of course, is that we don't know that until we know which subjects are in. A pretty foundational question, I would think. And also, what's the curriculum going to look like for those subjects? The way that is shaped will determine whether or not schools can work around the assessment and build it in a way they kind of have with NCEA, probably most people would agree a strength of the current NCEA system, or they have to change their approaches pretty radically in some cases to fit the single subject approach. Again, we don't know. Those are questions I think people in their submissions should be demanding the answers to, because they make such a big difference, not just for what's delivered on the ground for our young people, but how much work there is involved in preparing for the change.
Yeah,
so
and
absolutely.
I heard today too that there's talk that outdoor education might be one of the subjects that's going to be dropped. I mean, it's really hard for us, to not know this sort of detail, and we need to see what their thinking is about the subjects, because they've indicated there's going to be a lot less subjects. Well, what are they going to be? And for me, a telling statement in the document was, and I'll quote this: schools will have less flexibility in the design of individual learning programs because students will need to be offered whole subjects. And I just wonder why that's such a straitjacket. What do you think about the 4th proposal then, Kieran, about strengthening achievement?
I mean, there is a lot of anxiety out there that this will make the qualification, especially perhaps in its early years, inordinately difficult for many young people to achieve. There's a set of opinion out there as well that says, well, actually, it's time we did this, and I think that's valid for people to have that view as well. But again, the vast majority of people who are trying to evaluate whether this will work or not can't really say how well it's going to work, because they don't know necessarily where the boundaries are going to be. Just how hard is it going to be to achieve 4 subjects out of 5? Is that going to be much harder than it is now? It's going to be similar, or will it be more straightforward in recognition of the fact that this is a big extra burden on top of the additional on top of the existing requirements you need to get a qualification. I think the point about grades from 0 to 100, A to E, people have opinions on that. My view is that's a bit of it's kind of neither here nor there, in the sense that we currently already say not achieved merit excellence for NCEA. We have a way of cutting already, and with the external standards, that's already largely numerical. So in that sense, I think that distracts from some of the bigger changes, which are around the different focus on external assessment, the focus on subjects being the units of the qualification. But also there's perhaps a risk to some extent, Maury, you mentioned it earlier, about losing some information on the record of achievement about what young people can do. The descriptive nature of that record of achievement, I think, could still be retained, even with a change to the 0 to 100 kind of grading system. There's still a way for us to retain that. I think just need some creativity from the ministry to think about how they might do that.
Yeah, agree totally. And another quote from the document, students will be strongly incentivized to participate in external assessments. And I just really wonder what's driving that thought. And the fact that we haven't really been engaged in consultation around that. And I am worried about the students will need to pass 4-year-long single subjects to get the qualification. What happens to the student who passes 3? And gets 48% in their fourth one? Do they have to repeat a full year or what? That really worries me that we don't know the answers to those sorts of things. Keeping a bit of an eye on the time, Kieran. Do you want to? What's your concluding statements then to leave people with about what you think and what people could do?
Yeah, look, I think the key thing is that it's important that at this stage people don't let the lack of detail hold them back from launching full force into a detailed submission if that's really what you want to do. It's important that government hears from the sector in a really robust and detailed kind of way. So if we assume for a moment that, and there are 2 reasons for this, I think. And so if we assume for a moment that the government will go ahead with this proposal largely as it is, maybe with some tweaks, I think that raises a couple of key questions for us to keep in mind. And the first is, how much political will is there going to be to go back to the drawing board again if the government changes at some point? And how much appetite will the sector have for that? And I think the answer to both is probably fairly little, actually. So what that means is that we need to take this opportunity now to put in as much detailed feedback and demanding the answers to those questions we've heard about tonight as we can, but also ensuring that those questions, some of those details, and some of the ways we might be able to tweak this proposal to meet the needs of some of the young people that it might not serve, to make sure that is on the agenda of any new government when it comes in, so it actually has realistic, achievable things it can do without feeling like it needs to go back to the drawing board again, because I think that will distress a lot of people in schools if that was to happen.
Cool. That's a really strong message, Kieran. And I'd sort of like also I've heard some rumours that there's a bit of an open letter from quite a few principals that's going to be sent to the minister or the ministry as well around some concerns as well. So, I think everybody needs to take those opportunities to make a submission. And I suppose I leave people with, I've still got these questions, about, and I've got them because we haven't been engaged in the exploration and the discussion. I question why we need to introduce the straitjackets of external assessment, single year long subjects, the requirements of students to take 5 subjects and that qualification depends on them passing 4 of them. I'm really worried about that. It reminds me of what it was like when I was at school, way back in the 1970s. And I'm not sure that's where we should be looking, because I reckon there's a real lack of future focus in this whole proposal.
Yeah, and it's the key thing for people to keep in mind is whether you support the direction or not, as many people do not. There is, there's an opportunity here for us to really make our voices heard, and even if it's not listened to, the act of engaging democratically in that process and ensuring that it's on somebody's agenda in itself is a powerful, useful thing to do on behalf of the people we all serve. Yeah.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, Kieran. And thanks for making yourself available tonight and sharing those really important views. Really encouraging people to make a submission. So kia ora, everybody. Hope you find it, this Substack Live from Aotearoa Educators Collective, really useful. Thanks very much.
Ka kite anō.